Okay, well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to our webinar titled Leveraging Effective Feedback to Impact Student Growth. My name is Michael Ryan. I'm the manager of the Professional and Education Services team in Australia, New Zealand, and Hong Kong, but based in Melbourne. I'm just here to introduce the session today, and I will be handing over to our incredible guest presenters in just a moment. But I will just begin with a few little moments of housekeeping. First of all, I acknowledge that I'm hosting this webinar from the lands of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nation. In the spirit of reconciliation, Turnitin acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea, and community. As we share our knowledge of teaching and learning, we pay respect to our elders, past and present, as it is their knowledge and experience that holds the key to success for future generations. We extend that same respect to all First Nations peoples joining us today. And a huge welcome to all of you that are joining this webinar today. It's going to be incredible content, and we're going to get started in just a moment. I know that not all of you will have participated in a Zoom webinar today, so just note that your microphones and cameras are turned off by default. We will be sharing links to resources in the chat box. So that's the chat that quite a few people are popping in where they're joining us from now. My colleague Nick will be putting all of the resources in there. For those of you that are watching a recording, we will be sharing QR codes on the screen. So you're able to just pause the recording, snap that QR code, and you'll get access to the recording as well. And if the QR code's not working for you, you'll be able to email us and we'll share that email address with you. If you do have questions throughout the presentation today, we'd like you to put those questions into the Q&A button. So you'll notice there's chat and Q&A. The reason for that is you've noticed the chat has been going like crazy already and the questions will get lost. So by putting the Q&A, your questions into the Q&A enables us to thread your questions. You can respond to your peers' questions as well. We don't want you to only be able to ask questions during this live webinar, however. So if you're lying in bed at 3 a.m. and you come up with a question and you think, oh, I wish I asked that, we have created a space for you to do that after today's webinar is over. We have a site called the Turnitin Educator Network. And on that site, I've created a forum or a discussion for today's webinar. Nick will be popping the link for that into the chat just in a moment, or scan that QR code. You do need to sign up to an account to this forum. It's a platform called ForumB. But it is a free sign up and then you'll have access to that discussion. Feel free to post questions. Feel free to respond to your peers' questions as well. Today's webinar is the first part of a series of webinars that we're running. The next webinar is a direct follow-on from today's session. And it is a masterclass in how, or a technical masterclass, I might say, in how to use the specific grading and feedback tools. My colleague, Michelle Nicholson, will be hosting that session. Scan that QR code to register, or feel free to email us australia-pes@turnitin.com and we'll send you the link. On December the 9th, my colleague Nick will be hosting another webinar, which is about looking at the data that you can pull about your use of the grading and feedback tools. So another great session where you can learn how to review your data for 2021, look at the trends and gaps in your feedback, and then look at how you'll be able to adapt your teaching and learning for 2020. And then finally, for those two webinars, while my colleagues will be running the sort of technical masterclass in how to use those features, we want to hear from you because we firmly believe that the best knowledge about implementing and embedding those features into your classes come from you. So if you have a great little success story about using the feedback tools or perhaps the online grading report, please complete this little survey just to let us know that you'd be willing to share with your colleagues, and then we'll get in touch and we'll get that organised. So we would really love to hear from you so that you can share your knowledge with everyone. Skipped a slide, sorry about that. Okay, so here we go. We're up to the reason that we're all here today, which is to get into this webinar, leveraging effective feedback to impact student growth. This webinar today is based around this incredible research that it has been completed by the co-authors who have all joined us today, as well as Professor John Hattie, who will proudly say is from the University of Melbourne. As all New Zealanders know, we love to poach New Zealanders and claim them as Australian, so we'll do that today. With that, I'm going to hand over to Patty West-Smith, who is one of the co-authors of this paper and the Director of Customer Engagement at Turnitin. So thank you, and over to you, Patty.
Thank you, Michael. If you would, next slide, please.
I'm trying.
I see that. So I'll tell you a little bit while Michael's getting the slides sorted out. I'll tell you a little bit of background. Obviously, all of you are probably familiar with Dr. Hattie's work. We certainly are. Long before we worked on this paper with him, we were, I mean, frankly, devoted fans. Obviously, from an academic point of view, you know, we followed him because his work is very important. But to be clear, we really are devoted fans. And so Dr. Hattie's background, obviously, his work around visible learning, the way that I usually describe his work with visible learning is that it really took many of the things that were incredibly subjective in terms of what worked and what didn't in classrooms in terms of impacting student learning, and it brought it to a very concrete place. It actually put numbers behind it. And in many ways, it kind of changed the game in terms of educational research, and folks started to have much, much higher expectations for really understanding what the numbers and the data told us about what actually impacted student learning to the greatest degree possible. And so I joke a little bit about us being sort of just such great followers of his work, but it obviously is not something that is unique to us as a group of co-authors, because some of the phrases that you'll find if you look around to see what people have said about his work are things like visible learning is the holy grail of education. That's one of my favorite quotes. But my very favorite quote about Dr. Hattie himself is, he's not the Messiah, but he comes close. And in educational research terms, that is really what you need to know about him. And so from the earliest days of his work, he has been talking about the impact of feedback, and we've been following that. And in the earliest stages, what came out was that feedback had this incredibly large effect size in terms of the overall impact that it had on student learning. But in the early days, it was just feedback in general. What we've really been following for many years now, and what our new work, our new research really digs into, is what kind of feedback actually has the biggest impact on student learning. So next slide, Michael. So Michael gave you a little bit of background about us, and I won't belabor the point, but I do think that it is worth calling out that all four of us are veteran educators, which is something that we talk about with a great deal of pride. We never let folks overlook that about us. We work obviously in ed tech today, but our background for all four of us is in the classroom. And so between us, we have many decades of experience in the classroom. And I believe that between the four of us, we have taught students from every age, from early childhood all the way up to undergraduate degrees. Actually, Kristen, you might have actually even worked in a graduate level class, haven't you?
Yes.
So we literally cover the entire spectrum in terms of our experience. We also have some background in administration and curriculum and instruction, curriculum development. You know, and I don't say all of that to brag on all of us, although I like to brag on these other three ladies that I have the pleasure of being able to work with. But I think that it is important to educators to understand that they are hearing from other educators. And so we always take a little bit of time to make sure that you know that our work and our background is grounded in the classroom and in pedagogical practice. But more specifically for today, Michael, if you would, next slide. because I am a teacher by training, I always like to start with my objectives. I just can't help myself. It's who I am. So our objectives for today's session are pretty simple. First, we really want to dig into defining feedback and recognizing why it's essential to student learning. Very importantly, we want to dig into our sort of guiding light, our 5 principles of effective feedback and relevant research findings. I do think it's worth calling out that for every one of the principles we're going to talk to you about today, it is grounded in actual research that indicates that this is the kind of feedback that directly makes a difference in terms of student learning. And then, of course, we're going to dig into what is a very exciting topic for us, which is to really evaluate our most recent research findings related to where to next feedback and its impact on student growth. This one is really close to our hearts. You know, I think Jill has said this in the past, and it is perhaps the best characterization of just how proud we are of this work. You know, you often hear that you should not work with legends. You should not work with your icons or your heroes because they will always let you down. But I have to tell you, it's not true with Dr. Hattie. It absolutely did not hold true. The man is just amazing from an intellectual point of view, but he also is just a wonderful person. From a personal experience, I will share that the one time that we were able to meet with him in person, I was about 7.5 months pregnant at the time, and he showed up to our meeting and he brought me children's books from Australia because he thought it was important that my daughter start out on the right foot and learn about the best place in the world, as he explained it to me. So he really was absolutely just a dream to work with him. And then the last piece of our presentation today is that we're going to discuss how Feedback Studio can help facilitate effective feedback, because it's fantastic to know the sort of academic research, but we also want to make sure that we dig into the practical application of how this can live and breathe in your classrooms. Next slide. Okay, so I've told you that I am, at least, I'll say we are, but for sure I am something of an obsessed fan when it comes to Dr. Hattie's research and feedback in general, because there is a lot of research even outside of his work that is incredibly important. You know, and so the question I sometimes get is, why is this such an emphasis for you? Why do you focus on it so much? And to be clear, I was focusing on feedback long before I came to work for Turnitin. It's probably that focus that brought me to Turnitin, quite frankly, because I believe for a long time that feedback is one of the most critical aspects of education. And part of the reason that I believe that so strongly is because it is directly within our control. You can go to the next slide, Michael. That's where I was headed. Thank you. So this quote is one that I always like to share when we're talking about feedback, because I think it helps to build the context around why we put all of this emphasis on feedback. And so this is a compilation of sort of decades of research, including Dr. Hattie's work, but also some other sort of lions in the educational research realm. But I think it captures the ideas that really are at the heart of all the work that we do around feedback. Academic feedback is more strongly and consistently related to achievement than any other teaching behavior. This relationship is consistent regardless of grade, socioeconomic status, race, or school setting. Feedback can improve a student's confidence, self-awareness, and enthusiasm for learning. Now, so many of those factors that are being compared there, grade, socioeconomic status, race, school setting, these are things that are outside of our control as educators, right? I don't know about all of you, but I can tell you that from my nearly 2 decades of experience in public education, a constant for all of us, my colleagues and I, was just this feeling that so many factors that impacted student learning were really completely out of our control. Even when we were doing our absolute best work in the classroom, there were all of these other aspects of the world that impacted our students and their ability to learn and progress in our classrooms. But feedback is something that is entirely within our control as educators. And it actually exceeds the impact of all of those factors that we spend so much time really just sort of battling against that are outside of our control. And so because of that, I've always said that I believe that it is really the best weapon that we have in our arsenal to truly make a difference in terms of student learning, because we could get lost in all of those factors that we don't control, but this is one we do. So next slide, Michael. So I've talked a little bit in general about feedback, and I know that these are not definitions that will be new to any of you as veteran educators, but again, I'm a teacher at heart. And so I always want to start by making sure we have sort of shared definitions of the terms that we're going to talk about today. So throughout our presentation today, we'll be talking about different aspects of feedback. But at its heart, feedback is information about how one is doing in an effort to reach a goal. Now, in education, oftentimes that goal is set by us as the educators in the classroom. We use rubrics and we use other things to really set those goals and design those task expectations. But the feedback is what we deliver to students to help them understand how they're progressing toward that goal. There are two basic categories that we'll talk some about today when it comes down to feedback. Summative feedback, which is really evaluating achievement against some sort of established benchmark or standard, right? Like, this is what we want students to accomplish. How close are they in relation to that? And it normally occurs at the end of study. And that's important because with summative feedback, there's typically no opportunity to revise. And that's important because it differentiates it from formative feedback, the other category that we'll talk a lot about today. In fact, most of our conversation about feedback today will live in this formative feedback space. Formative feedback is differentiated from summative feedback because it is designed to improve learning and monitor progress to improve instruction. The really key characteristics are it's ongoing and it encourages revision based on the new understanding. And that's going to play a critical part to understanding the way that we approach this research that we conducted with Dr. Hattie, is that we were really looking at formative feedback where there is that ability to respond to the feedback and make revisions as part of the learning process. Next slide, Michael. By the way, you'll have to stop me if I just keep going with this presentation, because we've all done this so many times together that we've all done each component of this presentation. So I could very well just go off the tracks and keep going until the end of it. Jill will stop me though. She's good about that. All right, so now we've talked about feedback and I've said that we're going to really focus in on formative feedback. But what I said to you at the beginning is really critical to understanding. In the earliest days, back, decades ago when Dr. Hattie was first doing his first work around visible learning, we talked a lot about feedback. Oh, feedback is really important. We have to do it. That's the thing that has this greatest impact on student learning. And that's true. But what we've learned since then is that the quality of the feedback actually makes a difference in terms of how big an impact it has on student learning. So this is a really relevant quote that kind of summarizes some of the work from Dr. Hattie, as well as some of the other sort of leaders in this field, Robert Marzano, some other folks. I think Douglas Reeves is involved here. These are some of the big names who've done this research around it. And so what they've told us is that there are specific characteristics about feedback that actually make a difference in terms of the overall impact it has on student learning. So we know that feedback is essential for student learning, provided that feedback is accurate, timely, and specific. Research from Hattie and Marzano makes it clear that feedback is also among the greatest influences on student achievement. That goes back to that earlier slide I mentioned where we talked about it actually outpacing all of those other factors. So in fact, Hattie's meta-analysis of more than 800 meta-analyses, say that 3 times fast, a meta-analysis of more than 800 meta-analyses suggests that this impact is even greater than the socioeconomic status of the student. Now, I always emphasize this part when I'm giving this presentation because I think it's really critical to our understanding. And part of the reason we emphasize it is because, again, socioeconomic has been proven throughout many, many years of research to have this huge impact on student learning. It can, in fact, be the biggest barrier that students face when it comes to their student learning. But what we know is that when we have effective feedback that matches up to some of those characteristics, accurate, timely, specific, that it then outpaces the impact of socioeconomic status. And I go back to the earlier point that I made because I think it's worth repeating. This means that we actually have directly within our power as educators a tool that outpaces some of the factors that have become the biggest barriers to student achievement. And so honestly, at the end of the day, we can't put enough emphasis on feedback when we know that it has the power to have this great an impact. Next slide, Michael. So now, and and actually it's more than socioeconomic status, right? Like part of what we do is we look at what some of those specific teaching behaviors are that actually get measured up against the impact of feedback. So when I say feedback is this great tool and it's so powerful, blah, 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 I think it's important to compare it to some of the things that we see very commonly within classroom structures. Direct instruction with modeling and practice. Feedback, effective feedback, has a greater impact than direct instruction. Lecture, a very prominent strategy, especially for delivering new content. Effective feedback greatly outpaces the impact of lecture on student achievement. Behavioral intervention programs that are really designed for students who are struggling with behaviors that interfere with their learning, while they can have a great impact on student learning, effective feedback outpaces them. And of course, I come back to the one that I've already mentioned, socioeconomic status, which has, great impact and goes beyond an impact on student learning. It actually has an overall impact on quality of life. So we know that in terms of learning, effective feedback can actually outpace the impact of all of these aspects of classroom instruction. So now that we talked a lot about that kind of background, we really want to dig into this idea, going back to my objectives, what are the principles of effective feedback? Because we've said that feedback has a great impact, but we know that certain kinds of feedback with certain characteristics actually have an even greater impact on student learning than general feedback. So those 5 characteristics, I'm going to give you just an introduction to these, and then I'm going to turn it over to Jill, and I won't keep going with the presentation, even though that's my inclination. But the 5 principles that we have identified that have the greatest impact on student learning are accurate, meaning it depicts specific and correct information, relevant, correlating to the task expectations, accessible, communicated in a way that the receiver can understand, because at the end of the day, if the students don't understand the feedback, it can't make an impact on their learning. Timely, given as close to the submission as possible, and actionable, providing direct direction without telling exactly what to do. Now I'm going to turn it over to Jill, and she's going to dig into each one of these and the corresponding research a little bit more deeply.
Thanks, Patty. So now that we have looked at the principles of effective feedback and how we can construct effective feedback, let's explore the ways that Turnitin's Feedback Studio can help us achieve these principles. In order for the feedback we provide to students to be accurate, we must start by communicating clear and specific expectations for the task. Now, rubrics are an efficient way to articulate these expectations across multiple dimensions of the task and to show students what it looks like to meet proficiency standards, as well as what exceeding those standards or falling below those standards look like. In Feedback Studio, we provide pre-populated rubrics aligned to different years of study, different genres of writing, and even specialized content like science and historical analysis. Now, I do need to pause here because I can't talk about being accurate without acknowledging that the screenshot of this rubric and some of the quick mark comments on upcoming slides show resources that are available to Turnitin customers all over the world. And this means that they therefore depict spellings and titles that you'll notice are in American English. I want to point out that we do have rubrics and quick mark sets that are available in UK English. They span multiple genres and subject areas for years 7 through 12 in Australia and years 9 through 13 in New Zealand. And all are aligned to the Australian standards. So if you don't already have access to these feedback sets in your Feedback Studio account, be sure to attend the upcoming session on December 1st titled Harnessing the Power of Turnitin's Feedback Tools, and we'll explore these feedback sets further. All right, the second principle of effective feedback is relevance. And to be relevant, the feedback we provide to students should align explicitly to the stated expectations of the assignment. So when we use rubrics, we have an objective source of truth from which we can reference specific skills and the level of mastery that was demonstrated by each student. In Feedback Studio, several of our rubrics also come with corresponding quick mark sets. The feedback within these sets is derived from the specific skills within each category. And notably, it was written by the 4 expert teachers on this call. So when you choose these quick marks from these corresponding sets, you can be sure that the feedback you're providing to students is unbiased and aligned explicitly to the expectations of the task and genre. It's also worth noting that as an instructor, you aren't limited to using just the feedback tools that Feedback Studio provides to you. You and your administrator have the power to create or upload your own content, your own rubrics, and your own quick mark sets at any time. So I'm assuming we're all educators here, and I'm hoping it's a safe space that I can acknowledge a secret that as teachers, we don't speak to all students in the same way. We speak to each student in a way that they will best comprehend the information. We wouldn't want to confuse struggling students with rigorous vocabulary or discuss advanced skills if they haven't mastered foundational ones. So in Feedback Studio, we've crafted our quick marks with a growth mindset to reach students that are performing at varying levels of mastery according to the rubric. Comments written for students who are below proficiency in a particular trait are more concrete in nature, and they have scaffolded guidance to help them make their revisions to improve their writing. Comments written for students who meet or exceed proficiency encourage them to reflect on their behaviors and to consider more advanced writing techniques. Now, this next principle is arguably the most challenging to meet. And if your class rosters look like ours did, you likely have upwards of 100 students that demand your attention and expect your feedback on their performance. The research shows that students are more likely to read and use feedback if received during or immediately after their work process. We all know that this is a formidable expectation for teachers. No human can provide meticulously crafted feedback to hundreds of students the moment they submit their assignments, especially when you consider the additional demands and responsibilities that are expected of teachers on a daily basis. Feedback Studio, however, can help narrow this gap, that gap between the assignment submission and delivering feedback to students. I noticed a few of you had commented in the Q&A about how can we encourage students to read the feedback we're given. We all know that pain point. That is extremely frustrating if you spend the time to craft that feedback and they're not even reading it. But we know that the research shows if students receive that feedback closer to the time of submission, that they are more likely to read and use that feedback in order to make revisions. So our drag and drop quick marks provide that expertly crafted feedback in seconds, ensuring consistent and unbiased comments, even when we've reached that end of that tall stack of papers to grade and our fatigue finally sets in. So additionally, instructors can opt to record voice comments for students who would benefit from auditory feedback, or simply if you wish to add a personal touch. Now, the last tenet of effective feedback is that it provides the learner with their next steps, appropriately guiding the work, but not just giving away the answer. In Feedback Studio, we've patterned our quick mark comments after conversations we've had with our own students. In those conversations, we point to the areas of their writing where they're doing well or they need to improve, and offer accessible guidance in making revisions that will move them toward the next performance level. Some of our comments, you'll notice, are embedded with links to the resources that will dive a little deeper into a related concept or skill. If you choose to create your own quick marks, this capability is available to you as well. Now, it's fitting that I end on the topic of actionable guidance, as that was the focus of the research that we did with Dr. John Hattie. And I'll pass it over to Katie, who will talk to you a little more about that.
Thanks, Jill. So like Jill mentioned, we are here to really talk about this new research that we've had the pleasure of being a part of. So our newest study that we co-authored with Dr. John Hattie was published in May of 2021, so quite recently, in Frontiers in Education. And it's entitled Feedback That Leads to Improvement in Student Essays, Testing the Hypothesis That Where to Next Feedback is Most Powerful. Quite a mouthful, but a lot of great detail in just the title there. And I think that Nick is going to share the link to the full text document for you in the chat, so you can dig in a little bit in more depth later on at your leisure, because I'll only have the opportunity to share just kind of the overview with you today. Next slide, please. So in this study, our team that you are seeing here with you on the call today, we had the pleasure of working very closely with Dr. John Hattie to analyze over 3,200 student essays and the feedback that was assigned to those drafts within Turnitin Feedback Studio. Our analysis of these student essays and that associated feedback focused on which forms of instructor-provided feedback were more predictive of student improvement over time. So we're talking draft to draft. Now, our hypothesis in this study was that feedback that leads to where to next decisions and actions by students. So we were meaning truly actionable feedback, comments that guide students to making meaningful and effective revisions, that where to next feedback is most likely to enhance student performance on their work. In order to complete this analysis, we looked at paired student assignments. So all assignments that we reviewed had to have an original first draft that was submitted by a student, and then a revision draft of the same assignment submitted by that same student. And then we also took into consideration all of the associated feedback that's provided on those documents. The feedback was then in the form of comments. So all of that feedback was really written comments, which were provided by instructors. We then coded those depending on their content. And we also looked at the outcomes associated with that feedback related to growth and achievement between the two drafts as measured by rubric criteria. Now, after all of that, we were able to perform a correlation analysis of all of that data to determine how much those two pieces correlated with one another. Next slide, please. So from that analysis, we were able to come to the conclusion that our hypothesis was correct, which is a great validation for all of the things that we all practiced and thought was right for our students. It was a great validation of that. Where to next feedback has the greatest impact on student improvement between drafts. So that actionable, meaningful feedback that guides a student into what they should do next has the greatest impact on actual student improvement. It leads to the greatest gains from the first to the final submission, because that type of feedback seemed to be heard and actioned by students more frequently than other forms of feedback. And that's a really important part and ties back to, I think, a couple questions that came in and something that Jill mentioned too. How do we get our students to actually read the feedback and pay attention to the feedback? And it seems that when we give them a where to next piece, an actionable piece, they're more likely to take that, hear it, and action it because it's something tangible that they can do next. So what does this mean for instructors working with students? Feedback that clearly articulates a goal for a student and is actionable. So again, that piece that we're calling where to next. That's key. Students need to have that idea about where they should go next in order to make those effective revisions. When we encourage that behavior, we can have the most impact on student improvement. We can't simply point out what's wrong or even what's right and then leave it at that. We cannot assume that our students will know what to do with that and where they should go next on their own. We need to provide them that guidance to take those appropriate next steps. Now, with that in mind, as instructors, we also have to consider how we can scaffold that where to next feedback when necessary. So we should also consider feedback that focuses on helping our students understand where they are going and then how they are going as well. Now at Turnitin, we are really pleased to report that Turnitin Feedback Studio allows users to optimize those best practices and feedback, just like Jill just walked through for us. Feedback provided by Turnitin in the Quick Marks library follows this where to next format in most cases. And like Jill mentioned, instructors are encouraged to craft their own feedback following the where to next format as well. Now, to help you out in that space, I'm going to pass it over to Kristen, and she's going to do a few activities where we can learn a little bit more about how to craft effective where to next feedback.
Great, thank you, Katie. So over the next few slides, we will discuss what where to next feedback looks like within Feedback Studio. And if you are new to Feedback Studio or you're not using the marking tools yet, which is encouraged, these principles can be applied elsewhere whenever you'd like to leave where to next feedback. So in Feedback Studio, educators may leave feedback in various ways, as we've discussed, and one of which is using comments. And in the next few slides, we're going to situate where to next feedback within the format of quick mark comments. And those are those drag and drop comments that are organized as a collection of comments. As Katie just mentioned, a suggestion that came out of our recent research with Dr. Hattie was to scaffold the where to next feedback along with the where are they going and how are they going. And again, if you're familiar with Dr. Hattie's research, you'll know a little bit about those research types. But essentially, it's helpful to connect the feedback to the student's current learning state, as well as the success criteria that we've been kind of talking a lot about today. So in our crafting where to next feedback guidance, we've also included some of those principles. So on this slide, we've broken down where to next feedback into 3 essential components: issue, relevance, and action. So starting with number 1, state the specific issue related to the student's writing, which we're referring to as issue. 2, its relevance to the writing task, which is often communicated through a rubric. And 3, what the student should do next. So that's that action piece that we're talking a lot about with where to next. And it is important to note that the 3 components will not show up exactly as it shows on the template. Sometimes they may be mixed together in one sentence, or parts may be switched. We will all write our own feedback differently. It's just kind of being considerate about including all 3 of those pieces. So we have an example quick mark here, and you can see the 3 components highlighted. So this is the focus on task quick mark, and it reads, this section seems to be off topic, which is the issue for the part of the writing. Your essay needs to address the writing task. So this helps the students understand the relevance to the writing assignment or rubric, and reread the prompt question and stay focused on what the prompt asks you to do. So this very specifically gives guidance to the student on what to do next to address that piece of writing. Okay, next slide. So here are a few more quick mark examples. And I should mention that these quick marks are pulled directly from the quick mark sets that are preloaded into the Feedback Studio accounts. And as Jill shared earlier, you can also download some of those, some other quick mark sets on the website that was provided in the chat window, and upload them into your accounts. So 2 more. We have the reword sentence quick mark. So this sentence might be difficult for your readers to understand. the educator's identifying the issue. Reword the sentence, giving it an action. So your meaning is clear to your audience, and that's the relevance. And this is an example of where to next feedback that does not follow the template exactly. 2 components are organized into 1 sentence, and there's a swap of the order, and that is completely fine. And we'll look at one more example. This is the integrate quote quick mark. A well-integrated quote should read as though it is a seamless part of the sentence as a whole. So that states the relevance. Try reading the sentence aloud for action to ensure it flows naturally and your ideas are clear for issue. And I'd argue that the issue here, we could probably be a little bit more explicit, but you can see the student does have clear guidance on where to go next. Okay, next up, we have a little bit of hands-on practice, which we all have to do as educators, right? Okay, so we're going to hold a quick 2-question poll. You can read the questions on the slide and we'll pull up the poll in a second. And I think I've read enough quick marks aloud. So what we'll do is if you can go ahead and read each question, which is a quick mark, to yourself, and then try to indicate which component is missing. Is it issue, relevance, action, or none? So if we can pull down the poll, please, Ryan, or Michael, Ryan. And you can see both here. You might need to extend it a little bit. Yes. So go ahead and take a moment to read it to yourself. And we will broadcast results once we have many responses.
Kristen, I have the curse of having 2 first names, so I get called
Sorry.
Ryan all the time. But as a former teacher myself, I often used to get called Mum as well. So
yeah, same.
I think I'll take Ryan.
Yeah. I got a lot of moms before I was a mom.
We've got the responses coming in. For some of you, the poll should be popping up on your screen automatically. If you've got multiple screens, it might have popped up on one of the other ones. So just have a look across all of your screens. It will be either a white or a black box with the questions and the options to answer on it. Just while we're waiting for a few more responses to come in, I'll just respond to Ruth's question here. Yes, we'll provide a copy of the recording and we can send a copy of the slides to you as well. And the follow-up email will have lots of all the links and things that we've mentioned today. All right, I might just, I'll end the poll there and we'll bring the results up.
Okay, now everyone can see the results. Yeah?
Yep.
Great. Okay, so this is wonderful. So we have a mix of some responses here, but heavy in action, that's 74% action. That is correct. Yes, action is missing for that first quick mark. You might want to add something like revise the citation so the source is properly cited, or something to guide the student onto where to go next. And then for number 2, yes, we have 65% that relevance is the missing component here. Again, we want to make sure that the student understands the relation to the writing task. And so something like your essay should clearly focus on the central ideas, or something to help hone in that for the student would be great. And that is it for the polls. So great job, everyone. Thank you for playing with us. We hope that you found this helpful and that you can implement many of these concepts into your classrooms. We have one other thing that we want to touch on today. Michael, if we could go to the next slide, please. great. I'm not okay. I wasn't sure if the video was going to play or not on its own. So one moment before we start that little video, we want to make sure that you're aware of other feedback tools available to you. So we'll pop in the links to the chat window so you can explore these resources as we're talking about them. But starting with Gradescope, which is a Turnitin product for evaluating student work. And if you can press that little play for a minute, we might have to press the volume too. Yeah. Or maybe will the volume not work? Oh, volume doesn't work. Okay, so let's see if I can narrate for you. So with the video, it will discuss that Gradescope has a pen icon, and the pen icon allows you to write freely on student assignments. There's also a box icon, which allows you to kind of draw boxes to highlight areas for students for their student consideration. And there's also a little T icon, and that's essentially text annotation, which could be left anywhere on students' work. And Gradescope is a really great tool for evaluating assignments and assessments, and we encourage you to look at that link to learn more about that product. It might still be playing, but that's okay. I'll continue talking. So we also have many, many other instructional resources, which were mostly created by the individuals presenting today, as well as one other team member. And we call them instructional packs. And our instructional packs consist of educator guides, lessons, planning resources, activities, assessments, visual aids, you name it. And starting with our newest pack called Disrupting Plagiarism. And that is a collection of about 30 resources, and it focuses on helping the skills associated with academic integrity and providing feedback throughout the research and writing process. Another pack that we have is a source credibility pack, also a collection of about 30 resources. And that presents a guide for students to follow to apply to their research process to help them evaluate sources critically. And all of those resources are structured around a process, like a step-to-step guide for them. And then a paraphrasing pack, which is a little bit smaller but powerful with 11 instructional resources. And that's focused on the critical skill of teaching paraphrasing to students. And a little teaser, we're currently cooking up another instructional pack, which we plan to share next year. And that's it. And those will also be added to the chat window, the packs.
Now I've got the audio working for that video now. Is it worthwhile giving it another play, or what do you think, Kristen?
I think it's okay. I think that if they want to look, they can look at the website maybe. Unless anyone feels strongly.
It's more fun to let Kristen try to recreate it anyway.
Of course.
That was probably far more amusing.
Right, yeah.
Of course, we'll share the slides as well, so anyone will be able to access that video through those slides. But do check out gradescope.com. Even more videos on that website there. Okay. Well, we've come to the end of the main part of the presentation. So what we'll do now is we'll jump into our Q&A. So bear with me while I'm just going to be looking over at a different screen to bring questions up. I'll read them out for you, and then look, I'll just take volunteers from the four of you as to who's going to answer. A question that came in right at the beginning from Michelle was just what is meant by the phrase visible learning? And of course, that's the title of John Hattie's book as well.
Yeah, so just to add on to that, that is obviously, that's the title of Dr. Hattie's first book, and then he's come out with additional editions since then. But you know, it's interesting, that title is actually, it's pretty meaningful outside of just the fact that it is the title of his work, right? Because when I was talking to you initially about some of the research around feedback, you know, this idea that you could actually make the impact of specific instructional strategies really visible, that you could actually quantify the impact that a particular strategy was having. Not that that was a brand new idea, but it really wasn't all that common in educational research. In many cases, educational research had lived in a more subjective realm. And, so as a former administrator myself, we often found ourselves sort of responding to the buzzword of the day, right? Like what were people talking about? What were the trends? And then you would go and you would try to institute some of those practices in your schools and in your districts. You would do professional learning with your teachers to get them up to date on the most current trend. But, visible learning really took this different approach that said it's not enough to just think these things are effective or to think these are good practices, but to actually have some data behind it and to know which ones have a greater impact. Because at the end of the day, we have limited resources as educators. And I'm including among those resources our own time and bandwidth, right? Because educators can be exhausted by all of the conflicting demands that are present for us. And so knowing which particular instructional strategies and programs and initiatives are actually having the greatest impact on learning gave us the power to really decide where we were going to put our energy, where we were going to focus. And it really has changed a lot of things in terms of how we decide what is most important for us in terms of, actually having an impact on student learning, where we're really going to dig in and put the most of our emphasis. And so, yes, it's the title of the work, which is obviously one of the things we're alluding to, but it really is almost a conceptual change in the way that we thought about educational research and putting it into practice in real classrooms.
Thank you. Thanks, Patty. Another question from Christopher this time has asked, in your research, have you looked at the different impact of peer feedback versus educator or instructor feedback? Do we have a volunteer to answer that one?
So we did not look at that in this particular research that we've done, and there is some research around it in Dr. Hattie's visible learning work. You can look at, you can actually dig out the specifics about peer review. But interestingly, related to the work that we've done, we have a customer advocate in North America who actually has just completed her master's thesis, I think. And it's all related to how you can take the principles of effective feedback and put them into play in terms of how you structure your peer review. And she's doing that using the peer mark tools. And so she really has been looking in particular at not just her own feedback as an educator, but how the feedback from peer to peer can actually play an important role in terms of impacting student learning. I don't have the data available right off the cuff, because again, that wasn't part of our particular study, but there is some interesting research out there that shows that when using some of the same principles around what makes feedback effective, peer review can actually have a sizable impact on student learning as well.
Thanks, Patty. A question around the where to next feedback, this time from Ira, who asks, does where to next feedback have a similar effect on summative submissions?
Okay, you guys are going to force me to monopolize the Q&A. I can only handle so much wait time of silence before I jump in. You'll have to forgive me. The ladies that I work with here are well accustomed to me. I have no shortage of things to say. I apologize for that in advance. So it's important to note that if you look at some of the meta-analyses that Dr. Hattie has done over time in multiple editions, he does look at feedback in general, which includes both formative and summative feedback, right? And the research is clear that summative feedback can also have an impact on student learning. But the research that we conducted here is really looking at comparing feedback to feedback, which feedback has the greatest impact on student learning. And the way that we're able to measure that, I think Katie used this phrase, which is really important, is to look at progress over time, right? We're really looking for growth. To adequately measure that, we really have to look at the change from one to another version. We have to sort of compare apples to apples, right? We need to really be looking for that growth over time. And so where the research is really most powerful indicates that formative feedback that is delivered in the learning process with opportunity to revise is where sort of the biggest payoff comes in terms of crafting really effective feedback that aligns to the principles we've talked about today. That's not to say that summative feedback doesn't have any impact. It certainly does. There is research out there around it, but the feedback that has been proven to have the greatest impact is this formative feedback.
Another question that's come in, and I feel like this could be quite different for different assignment types, for different subject matter, but there's a question. Oh, it's just popped off my screen. Here we go. How much time is generally spent in providing feedback using these tools? So I guess that's connected directly to the Feedback Studio tools. Perhaps can you give some insights about how you can use those efficiently? I know we do have quite a few people on the call who have not used our feedback tools before, so they might not be aware of some of those, say, what it takes to just do a drag and drop, for example, or create your own quick marks.
Sure. I mean, I can talk a little bit about some of our quick mark sets and also just the other ways to leave feedback. So time is always an issue, which I know Jill kind of touched on timely earlier. And one aspect of Feedback Studio that we all very much appreciate as educators, I know I do, is the quick mark collections. And that's because essentially, to describe it, it is a library of comments, and it can be organized by, maybe you have a specific genre that you are leaving feedback on, or even a specific assignment that you do every year. And you find yourself kind of writing similar things all the time. And so what you can do is actually, you can do it two ways. You can either create your own set of kind of your own commonly used comments when you're working on that genre or that assignment, or you can use some of the preloaded the quick mark sets that are in the system, or can be downloaded and or shared amongst groups as well. That's really great. So if you have teams that are working together, you can share sets. And so that helps a lot with time because you're not writing the same thing over again. You can always customize them. You can add links. You can assign it to the criteria and the rubric, which is huge when we're talking about relevance and helping the student understand, what does that actually mean? I know there's a lot of questions about, well, I really want my students to know, to actually read it and use the feedback, while also just making sure that they understand as best they can what that feedback means and where it lives in the criteria is super helpful. So that's kind of one really great thing about the quick mark comments. Does anyone have anything to add about that?
So one thing I would add, Kristen, I think it's important to call out is, and I think, I know Jill alluded to this, and I think Katie did as well. The quick marks that are in those libraries have already been crafted with these principles in mind, right? And that's really important. Why? Because we're not naive. We understand that crafting the kind of comments that we're talking about here that are going to have that greatest impact on student learning, it takes a lot of practice and time to do that. And so the power of the quick mark library is, here you have this set of comments that have already been written, that are aligned to standards, that are aligned to rubric expectations, that have been written to be at different performance levels, at different developmental levels. And you can pull down from them without every single time you need to write a comment for a student having to start from scratch and craft that yourself. And you can use the comments that are there as a model as you're really working to incorporate these principles around where to next feedback. So I think the functionality is really powerful, right? Just to take away, here, I can quickly drag this comment. I know I have this one thing that I have to say to every single student, so I'm going to save myself a lot of time. But even in the content itself, it can be an incredibly powerful tool for you because it is, again, already designed to be aligned to those principles we outlined that really are what go into making feedback effective.
Thank you. I think I'll follow up with a question from Michelle. So after we've talked about how we can use these tools quickly and effectively in that timely manner, Michelle's just left a comment that she's using Feedback Studio to provide comments, but couldn't find a way to provide this electronically to students, can only do it as a PDF. Can anyone suggest how this can be provided? So I guess what I'll call out first of all is we have that other webinar coming up on December 1st, where we are going to go through more of the sort of technical masterclass of how to use rubrics and quick marks. But I don't want to leave you hanging until then, Michelle. So just note that if your students are submitting to you through Feedback Studio, when you create the assignment, there will be a start date, a due date, and a post date. The post date is the date that any of your grading and feedback will be released to the student. And so all they'll need to do is log into Feedback Studio again, click on the class name and the assignment name, and then their submission will show up and they'll be able to see all of that grading and feedback. Now, one thing about that post date is it's simply the date that your grading and feedback is released to the student. So you could set that, say, a week. I mean, that's not very timely, but maybe a couple of days after the due date so that you've got time to provide feedback to all of your students and release it to them all at the same time. But what I prefer to do is to set that due date, set the post date before the due date so that my students can see the grading and feedback that is being left on the papers. And then they've also got an opportunity to learn from the information that's in your feedback, that's in the similarity report. They can revise their work and resubmit before that due date comes. So I hope I've answered that okay. Would anyone else have anything to add to that? Nope.
I think that's perfect.
Cool. Okay. I'm going to throw a curly question to you, but in spirit of being open and honest and transparent, there's a question here that's from Wisnu that says, I've read that Hattie's research is criticised for its statistical issue. For example, Bergeron and Rivard, 2017. I don't know if you're familiar with this. Do you happen to have a take on this?
Oh, well, Michael, you're sort of inviting the most candid Patty to the conversation here in this moment. So I am familiar with the work, and I realize there is criticism out there around sort of the statistical approach to some of the work that Dr. Hattie has done over time. And I'll just be really candid with you. I'm not a statistician. I'm a literacy person, and so the stats part of it is the least comfortable part for me. But what I will say is that every criticism that has come out, first of all, statisticians criticize each other all the time for their approaches because there are always multiple ways to look at a set of data, which is true even if you're just looking at the raw numbers and you're not doing sophisticated statistical analysis. There are always different ways that you can look at it. And, you'll see this in the research world all the time, that folks will come out and they'll ask questions, even like when you're defending your dissertation. Sometimes people will question your methodology for your particular approach to the question. And so Dr. Hattie has actually himself talked about some of this publicly, and he said, look, I'm not pretending that the way that I have analyzed this data is the only way to look at it. It isn't, right? But one of the things that I think is most interesting about the feedback data in particular is that the results have stayed consistent over time. While the numbers might vary a little bit in terms of the overall effect size, like let's say maybe if we were looking at a scale of 0 to 10, this is a 10 in terms of the effect size. Maybe 2 years later, we come back and we say, oh, this is only 9.2 on this scale, right? And so there have been some variances. But what hasn't changed is that the effect size has remained significantly high, statistically significantly high, and that it comparatively to other instructional strategies, it always outperforms in terms of its effect. And so those things have stayed true. Now, if you really dig into the numbers, you can find lots of variables and you might find some questions. And look, I would say come to it with your own discretion, right? Each of you are trained professionals. You are in this field. And you're working with students on a day-to-day basis. But so what I'll say about myself personally is that over these years that I've been studying Dr. Hattie, as well as other educational researchers who have come to some of the same conclusions, is that if you take the numbers out of it, the reality is that when students get this kind of feedback, when they get effective feedback, they learn and grow. We can see that evidence ourselves. And so what I would say is you have to sort of triangulate, look at the data, ask yourself the questions, pose really hard probing questions, but then also see if it actually proves true in your day-to-day practice. I think that's the best test for whether you feel like you can trust this research.
Awesome, thank you. Thanks, Patty. There was a question, they keep moving on my screen and I keep losing the one that I picked out. Here we go. So this question is from Luke. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. I'm just saying they're an educator and librarian working in Australia with mostly Indian and Nepalese tertiary students. It's the first time that many of the students experience and learn within a Western pedagogical context. Do any of you have any insights or advice on how to support these students who also struggle with language and culture gaps? Patty's just waiting.
I was kind of waiting for Katie to jump in because she has some background in this area, some specific advanced training, so I don't want to steal her thunder.
Yeah, I can say a little bit. I definitely don't want to set myself up as an expert in this particular situation because I'm not. This is not a situation that I've worked with. But what I would say is scaffolding is going to be a huge piece of the puzzle here, and making sure that supporting your students in all of those areas. They're going to need more time. They're going to need more help. They're going to need more support in almost every area. So going into that situation, knowing that that's the case and being prepared to make those accommodations, I think that will be very helpful. And, from a more personal standpoint, empathy is going to be huge in this space too, right? Knowing that they have than peers in other situations, having the empathy for that situation and, trying your best to find ways to help them in all of those areas. I don't know if that necessarily answers the entire question that you're looking for, but that's my first approach to how I would try to address those issues.
I think it's important also to harken back to the principle of accessibility, right? Like making sure that you're meeting the students where they are in the feedback that you provide. I think Jill said it best. Sometimes the language that we use is not always familiar to our students. And that's regardless of whether it's their first language or not, right? Like so sometimes the language of educators is not familiar to students. And so really thinking about how to craft your feedback in ways that are going to be accessible to the individual student is going to be really critically important. But I would also encourage you to model the process, not just the content, right? What does it look like to respond to feedback from your instructor? If you can actually model for your students what it looks like if you are given feedback and how you would respond to it, I think that can really help to start to break that down. But I think Katie made the most important point in this kind of situation, which is just it's going to take more time and more practice, right? And so you have to sort of keep that in mind and understand that that's going to be a part of it. But it is more than just the content that you have to break down, but you actually have to break down the process too. What does it look like to get feedback? How do you respond to it appropriately? What questions might you ask? I think you can go a long way toward helping them to model some of those behaviors.
Thank you. Look, I think because we're approaching the end of our time this morning, so I think we'll call it there on the questions and answers. What I will do though is, if you forgive the fact that I'm going to exit out of this slideshow for a moment, if it will let me, because I just want to skip back to this slide here, where this discussion that we're having today, which is so incredibly valuable, we can continue this going. So if you do head to the Turnitin Educator Network, grab your phone out, scan that QR code, it will take you to this discussion topic. We've got the ability to continue asking these questions and continue responding to each other. And I have to say a huge thank you to all of you who are popping in responses to each other's questions on the Q&A as well. That's what we'd love to see happening here in the Turnitin Educator Network. So with that, we didn't have any other slides at the end after Q&A, did we? I missed anything? No. So with that, I'll wrap up the session just by saying a huge thank you to all of our guest presenters today for sharing all of your wisdom and your knowledge with us. And not only doing that, but doing it at dinner time for you as well. We really do appreciate making it work for us in the Southern Hemisphere. Very grateful. So thank you everyone for joining this session today. Huge thank you again to Patty, to Jill, to Kristen and to Katie for sharing all of that information. And we'll catch you again at our next webinar on December the 1st. Okay, thank you everyone.
Thank you all.